began my lesson by alluding to an old Negro spiritual that asked the question, were you there when they crucified my Lord? And there's just a whole host of characters that played their part in the drama of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And I talked with you last week about the women who followed Jesus. And I didn't get through. There's more to say about these women, and we want to pick up where we left off. But since some of you were out of town last week, let me just quickly review some of the things that I said last week. The gospel writers tell us that the women were with Jesus in Galilee, and some of them at least financially supported Jesus. And I think there's some lessons that we can learn from that. Jesus knows what we do for him, even if nobody else does. Only 3 of the women are named in the gospel record when these women who follow Jesus in Galilee are talked about, but there were other women as well. Jesus knows what we do for him, whether anybody else knows that or not. And following Jesus sometimes means leaving others behind. These women who follow Jesus must have left their family, maybe their friends, behind at least for a time to follow Jesus. And it occurs to me as I think about this part of their story that gratitude for what Jesus has done for us should motivate us to serve him. These women had been healed by Jesus. As a result, they followed him. And some of these women would have been rather well-to-do financially. And even though the New Testament teaches that it's hard for wealthy people to go to heaven, we read about some wealthy women who served Jesus. And it occurs to me that all of this should teach us that what we can do for the Lord, we should do. And then we noted last week that these women were with Jesus at the cross, and there's things that we can learn about that. These faithful women followed Jesus even when the apostles did not. Even though the apostles swore that they would never forsake Jesus, they did forsake him in his hour of trial, but these women didn't do that. They were right there with Jesus at the cross. When you compare the various records concerning this part of their story, we learn that Mary was the mother of James the Less, and Joseph perhaps the wife of Clopas. And Jesus likely had family connections with at least one of these women. It sure looks like, when you compare the gospel accounts, that Salome is the wife of Zebedee, the father of John and James, and likely the mother of Jesus. And so Jesus would have been a first cousin to James and John, and since Mary was related to Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, there's family connections with the forerunner of Jesus. That might help explain some things that we read about in the gospel record. And then we noted that differences in the gospels are not necessarily contradictions. When you look at all of the accounts, the number of the women is different in some of the accounts, and the location of the women is different. We talked about all of that last week. I'm not going to say more about that, but just remind you that differences in the Gospels are not necessarily contradictions. And then we noted last week that the women were with Jesus when he was buried in the tomb. And what can we learn from that? Well, the two Marys, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, they knew where Jesus was buried. They saw that happen, and they knew how Jesus was buried. You know what that means, folks? They would not have gone to the wrong tomb on that Sunday morning. Well, here's where we pick up our story this morning. And one might think it's a rather minor part of the story, and yet there's some important things that we can learn from the fact that at least two of these women that followed Jesus prepared spices for Jesus' body late Friday afternoon. What does Luke tell us? Well, he says in Luke chapter 23, verse 56, then they returned and prepared spices and fragrant oils, and they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. So it's obvious, I think, that Luke tells us a couple of things in that passage. These women prepared spices and fragrant oils. They were planning to come back to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus, and they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment of God. Now, is there anything that we can learn from that? Well, obviously, I think there is, or I wouldn't be talking with you about it. First of all, may I say to you, these women were convinced that Jesus was dead. You don't go through all of the trouble of preparing spices and fragrant oil to anoint the body of someone if that someone is still living. These women believed, they were convinced and convicted that Jesus had died on that cross. Well, that's important for us to notice. May I also suggest to you that they were not expecting a resurrection, despite the fact that Jesus had repeatedly predicted or prophesied that he would be raised from the dead. We are told repeatedly that when Jesus made these predictions to his apostles, they didn't understand. They didn't get it. Well, these women didn't get it either. They weren't expecting a resurrection. I am impressed by the fact that they respected God's law concerning the Sabbath. They rested on the seventh day, just as the law commanded. And, folks, they wouldn't break the Sabbath even for someone they dearly loved. Do we ever fudge when it comes to the commandments of God? Because it's going to interfere with our relationship with family or friends? Yes, there's some things that we can learn from this rather minor, insignificant part of their story. And then on that Sunday morning, the women found the tomb empty. Now, this part of the story is recorded at some length in all three of the synoptic gospels and briefly in John's gospel. I'll not take the time to read all of these accounts, but I want to read Matthew's account in Matthew chapter 28, beginning in the first verse. Now, after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat on it. His countenance was like lightning, and his clothing as white as snow. and the guards shook for fear of him and became like dead men. But the angel answered and said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come, see the place where the Lord lay, and go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead, and indeed he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him. Behold, I have told you." Now let me read what John tells us in John chapter 20, verse 1. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. What do the gospel writers tell us? Well, the angel told the women he's not here. He's been raised. What else do they reveal? Well, different women are named in the various gospel accounts, and we're told that they came to see the tomb, they came to anoint Jesus' body. There was this great earthquake. An angel rolled back the stone. Mark tells us in his account that as the women were making their way to the tomb, they were wondering, who's going to remove the stone for us? How are we going to get inside? I think I mentioned last week that it has been estimated that the stone that sealed the entrance of the tomb would have weighed somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 to 2 tons at a minimum. But Matthew tells us there was an angel that rolled back the stone, and then he sat on it. And the guards shook for fear. The women, as I already mentioned, wondered who's going to roll the stone away. When they get to the tomb, the stone's already rolled away. And they go inside the tomb, and they did not find Jesus' body. Some of this information comes from the other accounts that we did not read. The angel tells them he's not here, he's risen. Come, see the place where the Lord lay. We're told that there was a young man sitting on the right side inside the tomb. The women are instructed to go tell the disciples that Jesus was risen. What can we learn from this part of the story? It would have been impossible for anyone to steal the body of Jesus. We'll talk more about that in our study at the 10:30 hour. We need to be impressed by the fact that the two Marys, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, they were credible witnesses. The gospel writers tell us that they saw Jesus die. They were there at the cross. And these two Marys saw Jesus buried in the tomb, and now on Sunday morning, they find the tomb empty. This part of the story also should remind us, as we've already said last week, differences in the gospel accounts are not necessarily contradictions. There are differences in the gospel accounts with respect to this part of the story. And these differences are touted by skeptics and critics of the Bible as evidence that we can't trust the gospel accounts of the resurrection. So this is something that we need to give some attention to. Well, the gospel writers describe the women at the tomb variously. Matthew mentions Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Mark mentions Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and a woman named Salome. Luke mentions Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and other women. And in John's account, only Mary Magdalene is mentioned. Do you see differences in the accounts? Nod your head this way. They're there, but they're not contradictions. None of the gospel writers name all the women at the tomb. It's obvious when you compare the accounts that the other Mary is Mary the mother of James. Salome would have been included in that group that Mark calls other women. Or was it Luke? I don't remember. We need to recognize the fact that mentioning one person does not necessarily exclude others. If I come home from work and I tell Kathy that I talked with my good friend Jim Deason on the phone, should she necessarily conclude that that's the only person that I talked to through the course of the day? Should she conclude that Jim Gregg didn't pop in sometime that afternoon like Jim often does, and I chatted with Jim for a little while simply because I didn't mention that part of my day? Why, the answer's obvious, isn't it? Mentioning one person does not necessarily exclude others. And then I want you to notice that when Mary Magdalene goes to and reports to Peter and John that the tomb was empty, notice what she says. We do not know where they have laid him. You reckon she used that plural pronoun because there were others with her at the tomb and John just doesn't mention them? Is that so incredible that we can't believe that explanation? I think not. Well, then the gospel writers tell us different things about when these women came to the tomb. Matthew says they came after the Sabbath as the first day of the week began to dawn. Mark says when the Sabbath was passed, very early in the morning on the first day of the week. Do you see any essential difference between the time in those two accounts? No. Luke says they came on the first day of the week very early in the morning. All three of those statements are essentially describing the same time of day, but John says on the first day of the week early while it was still dark. What's up with that? Does this look different than that? Well, yeah, it looks different than that to me. Does that mean that the gospel writers have contradicted themselves? Not at all. These women began their journey. Remember, they're staying outside of Jerusalem, probably in Bethany. That's a couple miles away. They began their journey while it was still dark. They were coming to the tomb as the first day of the week began to dawn, or very early in the morning, and they arrived when the sun had risen. Does that make sense to you? It makes sense to me. There is no contradiction. But it might at first look like there's a contradiction. And then what about those angels at the tomb? Matthew says there's one. Mark says there was a young man. Luke says there were two men. John says there were two angels. Matthew says that this one angel sat on the stone, Mark says the young man was sitting on the right side inside the tomb. Luke says these two men stood in the tomb. John says that these two angels were sitting at the head and the foot of where Jesus had been laid. Matthew says this angel had a countenance like lightning. All four of the gospel writers describe these beings as being clothed in white, and all four of the gospel writers tell us that these angels spoke to these women. Are there differences in the accounts? Yes, that's pretty obvious when you look carefully. Are there contradictions? No. The Bible reveals that angels are called men when they take on human form. Do you remember how Abraham was notified that God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? We're told that 3 men came to visit Abraham. We learn later that 2 of these men were angels and one of them was the Lord. Angels are often clothed in dazzling apparel. It may very well be that different angels were involved at different points in the story. It may very well be that you've got one angel that rolled the stone away, and he sits on the stone, and he greets the women as they approach the tomb. And then when the women go inside the tomb, there's 2 other angels. And then again, you might have the same angel in different locations at different times. Maybe that angel that sat on the tomb got up and went inside the tomb, and there was another angel that appeared with him. Mentioning one angel does not exclude others. And that it may very well be that we've got different appearances. John tells us in his account that when Mary Magdalene came to the tomb, she found the tomb, or the stone, rolled away from the door. She then runs to tell Peter and John what she's seen. Peter and John run to the tomb to investigate, and then we're told that 2 angels appeared to Mary. This isn't the same appearance. A difference does not a contradiction make. And then the gospel writers tell us that the women reported what they had seen. I've got to catch up with myself in my notes. Matthew says, so they went out quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to bring his disciples word. And as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, rejoice. So they came and held him by the feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brethren to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. And Mark reports, so they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they trembled and were amazed, and said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So what do the gospel writers tell us? Luke says, then they returned from the tomb and told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. And then he names the women. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. And their words seemed to them like idle tales, and they did not believe them. John says, now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Then she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved and said to them, they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. What do these accounts reveal? Well, they tell us that the women experienced mixed emotions. There was joy and fear. Now, is that so hard to comprehend? That an event like this would produce mixed emotions in someone? Well, not at all. The women ran quickly to tell the disciples, and while they're on the way, Jesus appeared to them, and they held on to Jesus' feet, and they worshiped him, and then they reported what they had witnessed, and the apostles didn't believe them. Well, what can we learn? Folks, we learned that the gospel accounts of the resurrection were not made up. I say that because the testimony of women was not valued in the first century. And their words seemed to them like idle tales, and they did not believe them. Michael Licona, in his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, observes, and I'm quoting, precisely because of the low view of women in antiquity, many see the appearances of the women, and to Mary Magdalene especially, as historical, given the criterion of embarrassment. It seems unlikely that the evangelists, especially Mark, would either invent or adjust existing testimonies to make the women the first witnesses of the resurrection of Jesus, if that is not what was remembered in the earliest traditions. Why fabricate a report of Jesus' resurrection that already would have been difficult for many to believe, and compound that difficulty by adding women as the first witnesses? That doesn't make any sense. The gospel accounts of the resurrection were not fabrications. Now, folks, these women didn't have a hallucination. We're told that they held on to the feet of Jesus and they worshiped him. And Jesus talked to them. And we need to be impressed by the fact that the apostles were not credulous. They were not men that would just believe whatever they were told. They didn't believe the women at first. Which tells us they weren't expecting a resurrection. At first glance, I think the women who follow Jesus are often overlooked. But they played a very important part in the drama of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And there is much that we can learn from them if we will only pay attention. And there's one other passage that I skipped over for sake of time. And we'll just have to leave that. Thank you for your very kind attention.